Hey guys, tonight we begin with a drug so safe, so thoroughly, demonstrably, chemically safe, that the company selling it called it the aspirin of the 20th century. They were not wrong about the sales, they were spectacularly wrong about everything else. But before we settle into tonight's story, if this feels like the kind of late-night history that belongs in your feed, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if you happen to be in a country where thalidomide was once sold without a prescription, mention that too. Now dim the lights a little, get comfortable, and let's spend the night in the gap between what a drug was supposed to do and what it actually did. On Christmas morning 1956, a baby was born in West Germany with no ears. Not underdeveloped ears, no ears. The father worked for the pharmaceutical company Chemie Grünenthal. The company noted the case. Then it continued shipping product. That baby was the first. Nobody used the word first at the time, because to use the word first you need to know there will be a second and a third, and eventually a count so large it stops feeling like a number and starts feeling like something else. At the time it was just a birth defect, tragic, unexplained, the kind of thing that happened in the world before anyone understood why. The company filed no report, changed no formula, pulled no samples. It was Christmas, and they had a drug to sell, and the drug, as everyone agreed, was safe. The drug was called Contergan in Germany. Elsewhere it went by Distaval, Tensival, Softenon, Kevadon, and roughly 33 other names depending on which country you were in and which company had bought the license. The active ingredient in all of them was thalidomide, and thalidomide in the middle years of the 1950s was not a scandal waiting to happen. It was a solution to a real problem, developed by people who believed they had done the science correctly. That is the part that tends to get lost. West Germany in 1954 was a country rebuilding itself on pharmaceuticals. The antibiotic revolution had just happened, penicillin, streptomycin, the whole cascade, and the public understanding of medicine had shifted permanently. Drugs worked now, not in the old folk remedy, crossed fingers sense. They actually worked, measurably, repeatably, and the industry producing them was expanding fast into a market that trusted it. Chemie Grünenthal had started as a soap company, then pivoted to antibiotics when the post-war market opened up. It was not a firm with deep roots in chemistry. It had roots in leather, and before that, in brewing. What it had was ambition, a factory in Stolberg, and a head of research named Heinrich Müchter, whose main qualification for the job was wartime experience working on antiviral compounds for the German army. In 1954, one of Müchter's assistants, a chemist named Wilhelm Kunz, isolated a byproduct during unrelated work. A pharmacologist on the team named Herbert Keller looked at the structure and recognized it as an analogue of glutathione, which was already used as a sedative. They ran some tests. The results were, by the standards of the era, extraordinary. The standard way to measure a drug's danger was the LD50 test, the dose required to kill half the animals in a test group. For barbiturates, which were the dominant sleeping medication at the time, that threshold was not very high. Barbiturates were genuinely dangerous. People overdosed on them constantly, sometimes by accident, sometimes not. Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, the whole shadow that ran through the glamour of the 1950s, the sleeping pill that worked too well. Thalidomide in the animal tests produced no such number. Researchers could not find a lethal dose. They kept increasing the amount and the animals kept not dying. From this, the company drew a conclusion that was not unreasonable given what they knew, and catastrophically incomplete given what they didn't. The drug was essentially non-toxic, safe in a way that nothing before it had been safe. A sedative you could not accidentally take too much of, which in 1957 was not a minor selling point. It was the whole pitch. The marketing said so directly. Absolute non-toxicity, one brochure announced. Another called it outstandingly safe. An advertisement for the British version, Distaval, stated that it could be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers, without adverse effect on mother or child. That last line was not a rogue claim by an overeager copywriter. It was the company's position. It was what they believed. The test animals had not died. Therefore the drug did not kill. The logic was airtight if you never asked what the test animals had not been asked to do. Nobody had tested it on pregnant animals. This was not a secret Grunenthal kept. It was not a corner they cut while knowing they should have turned. Testing drugs for effects on the developing fetus was not required by law in West Germany. It was not standard industry practice anywhere in the world. The discipline that would eventually study such things, teratology, the science of birth defects and their causes, barely existed as a formal field. Researchers did not run those experiments because it did not occur to the regulatory framework that such experiments were necessary. The gap was not in anyone's conscience, it was in the architecture of what science thought to ask. On October 1st, 1957, Contagon went on sale in West Germany, over the counter, no prescription required. Within months, it was the best-selling sleeping aid in the country. Within 2 years, an estimated 1 million people in West Germany alone were taking it daily. 14 pharmaceutical companies were selling it in 46 countries under at least 37 different trade names. The British advertisement ran in medical journals. Doctors recommended it for headaches, anxiety, insomnia, colds, nausea, and morning sickness. Not because Grunenthal specifically promoted it for all of those things, but because a drug that's safe seemed appropriate for anyone, including the most vulnerable patients a physician might have. The drug moved the way good news moves. Quickly, without much friction, welcomed in advance of the evidence. Hospitals stocked it. Pharmacies displayed it. Countries approved it one after another, often with no more scrutiny than a review of Grunenthal's own data, which reported what Grunenthal had found, which was that the drug was safe, which was what everyone already believed. There was no warning to ignore. There was no secret to uncover. There was a Christmas baby born without ears whose father worked at the company, and a file that was not opened, and a drug that was already in 46 countries by the time anyone began to suspect that the question nobody had asked might have an answer, but he wanted. The drug arrived into a world that was ready for it. Not ready in the sense of waiting, ready in the sense of having exactly the right shape of problem for it to fill. The problem was barbiturates. By the middle of the 1950s, barbiturates were the standard prescription for anxiety, insomnia, and nervous tension, which in the post-war decade covered approximately everyone. The war had been over for 10 years, but its residue had not gone anywhere in particular. Soldiers had come home changed in ways that did not resolve cleanly into civilian life. Wives and mothers who had held everything together for years were discovering that peace did not automatically produce calm. Cities were loud and crowded, and the pace of ordinary life had accelerated into something that required management. The pharmaceutical industry had an answer for this, and the answer was a class of drugs that slowed the nervous system down to a speed people could live inside. Barbiturates worked. That was the honest thing to say about them. They produced sleep in people who could not sleep, reduced anxiety in people whose anxiety was making them non-functional, smoothed the edges of a world that had too many of them. The problem that no advertising copy mentioned and that physicians delivered quietly, if at all, when handing over the prescription, was that the gap between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one was narrow enough to cross by accident. Not narrow in the metaphorical sense, narrow in the pharmacological sense, measurable in milligrams, variable across individuals in ways that could not always be predicted. A person who had taken 3 tablets on Monday and been fine might take 4 on Friday and not wake up on Saturday. The arithmetic was unforgiving, and it did not announce itself in advance. Physicians knew this. Pharmacists knew this. Patients knew this in the general way. People know things they would rather not think about too carefully. A bottle of sleeping pills on the nightstand was either medicine or a decision, depending on the night, and there was not always a clear line between the two. The names that ended up in newspapers were famous enough to be remembered, but the ones that did not end up in newspapers were far more numerous. Barbiturates killed people who had not meant to be killed. and they killed people who had, and the medical profession had been looking for an alternative for years, something that worked without carrying that particular arithmetic behind it. Thalidomide was the alternative, a sedative that could not be taken in a fatal dose, that had been tested in animals at quantities far beyond anything a human would consume, and had produced no deaths, that could be handed to a patient with genuine anxiety or genuine sleeplessness, without the calculation that accompanied a barbiturate prescription. Doctors did not hesitate to prescribe it because hesitation would have required a reason, and everything available to them said there was none. Grunenthal understood what it had. The marketing that followed the drug's development was not restrained or cautious. It was the marketing of a company that believed it had solved a problem the medical profession had been struggling with for years, and intended to make sure everyone in the medical profession understood this. The push began before the drug was formally approved in Germany. Through 1956, while the authorization from the Ministry of the Interior was still being processed, the company flooded physicians and hospitals across the country with free samples. This was not unusual practice. Pharmaceutical companies routinely distributed samples to create familiarity with a product before its official launch, and the regulations of the time permitted it without significant restriction. Doctors received packets of Contagon with literature attached. The literature summarized the test results. The test results showed the drug was non-toxic. The doctors filed the literature, kept the samples, and began reaching for Contagon when a patient came in unable to sleep. The advertising that followed the official launch in October of 1957 was direct in a way that would not be possible now. Grunenthal's materials described the drug's toxicity profile, that is, its essential harmlessness, in language that left no room for qualification. Absolute non-toxicity was the phrase that appeared in one brochure. Another described the drug as outstandingly safe. The company's representatives visited physicians across West Germany with the data in hand and the message consistent. This is the drug you've been waiting for. A sedative without the risks of sedatives. A sleeping pill that could not kill. The British arrangement arrived in July of 1957, when Grunenthal signed a 16-year contract with the Distillers Company, a firm considerably better known for producing Scotch whisky than for distributing pharmaceuticals, which had moved into the biochemicals business after the war as part of a broader expansion. Distillers marketed thalidomide across the United Kingdom, Australia and New Zealand under the name Distaval, and their advertising made the safety claim with the same absence of hesitation. The advertisement that ran in British medical journals, the one placed where obstetricians and general practitioners and midwives would see it, stated that Distaval could be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers without adverse effect on mother or child. Not probably safe, not generally well tolerated, complete safety. The kind of claim that if anyone had paused to ask what evidence supported it, would have produced an answer that began with the phrase "the animals did not die." But no one paused to ask because the claim was consistent with everything else the drug was saying about itself, and because the doctors reading the advertisement were not in the habit of treating pharmaceutical marketing as a research problem. They were general practitioners with full waiting rooms, or obstetricians managing complicated pregnancies, or midwives trying to make the early months of pregnancy survivable for women who were spending large portions of every morning being sick. The claim fitted neatly into a gap they had all been aware of. Morning sickness was that gap. Not in the dismissive sense that phrase has sometimes been used, not a minor inconvenience that women of previous generations managed without complaint, but in the sense of nausea severe and persistent enough to make ordinary life difficult for weeks or months at a stretch. Some women lost significant weight in the first trimester. Some could not work. Some could barely leave the house. The medical profession had relatively little to offer them. Barbiturates were not considered appropriate during pregnancy, not because of any understanding of fetal drug exposure, but because they passed into breast milk, affected maternal alertness, and carried the overdose risk that made them problematic in any context. What thalidomide offered, a drug that was essentially inert in terms of toxicity, that produced no hangover effect, that the animal tests had shown to be safe at any dose, seemed not just acceptable, but genuinely compassionate. Prescribing it to a woman in her first trimester was not a failure of judgment. It was judgment applied correctly to the information available. The information available was incomplete in a way that nobody understood yet. What the data had not asked, what the regulatory systems of West Germany, Britain, Australia, Canada, Japan, and 39 other countries did not require anyone to ask, was what the drug did on the other side of the placenta. The placenta was understood to be a protective barrier, something that regulated what passed from the mother's bloodstream to the developing embryo. The understanding was not unreasonable. It was based on genuine biology. Many substances do not cross the placental barrier in meaningful concentrations, and the general assumption, reasonable, not yet challenged by evidence, was that a drug that was safe for the mother was safe, or at minimum neutral for the child. The assumption had not been tested because testing it was not part of the process. There was no requirement to test it. There was no standard method for testing it. Teratology, the study of what causes birth defects, of how the developing embryo responds to chemical exposures, was not yet a discipline with established protocols, specialist journals, or a critical mass of researchers working within a shared framework. The question existed. The tools to answer it did not. This is the gap that the compass points to, and it is important to sit with what it actually means. The failure was not a failure of attention or ethics or courage. It was a failure of infrastructure. Nobody had built the system that would have generated the warning. The people who approved the drug, who prescribed it, who took it, they were not ignoring evidence. They were operating in a world where the evidence had not yet been produced, because producing it required a scientific apparatus that had not yet been assembled. The drug moved through that world with the momentum of something that had already been vetted, which it had, just not for this. Within 2 years of its German launch, it had moved from an experimental compound in a factory in Stolberg to one of the most widely used medications in the Western world. There was one place where this did not happen. East Germany had a central committee of experts for drug traffic. This committee reviewed the thalidomide application at some point in the mid-1950s and declined to approve it. The records of their deliberation are not detailed. They did not have data that Grunenthal had suppressed. They had not run tests that the company had avoided. They reviewed what was submitted, applied whatever criteria they were working from, and said no. The decision was not announced. It was not presented as a finding. It was filed and the committee moved to the next item. Nobody in West Germany thought much about it. One committee among many had declined one drug among many. The drug was available everywhere else, including every other country with a border touching East Germany's. The East German decision registered as a minor friction in the licensing process, not as information, and certainly not as the data point that would prove, within a few years, to be the single most important piece of information the story contained. At the time it was nothing, a no from a committee, filed and forgotten. By the end of 1959, Contagon was the best-selling sleeping pill in West Germany. It was also, by then, beginning to produce signals that the company was receiving and choosing not to follow. Physicians were writing to Grunenthal with reports of a specific pattern of side effects in long-term adult users: numbness and tingling in the hands and feet, difficulty walking, a nerve-related damage called peripheral neuritis that appeared to be caused by the drug and did not fully resolve when patients stopped taking it. A doctor named Voss wrote to the company in October of that year with multiple cases. He was not alone. By November he was writing again, more urgently, warning of possible toxicity. The company's response was to send him more advertising materials. Their position, stated in internal correspondence and in the letters they sent back to concerned physicians, was that the clinical evidence from the original trials had demonstrated safety, and that individual case reports from general practitioners did not constitute evidence sufficient to revise that conclusion. There was a logic to this position that was not entirely dishonest. Individual case reports are, in isolation, weak evidence. A drug taken by 1 million people will produce coincidental health events in large numbers of them, and distinguishing drug-caused effects from coincidental ones requires the kind of systematic data collection that was not happening in 1959. What Grunenthal was doing, however, and what would later be described in considerably less charitable terms, was receiving signals and choosing the interpretation that preserved the product. The Neuritis reports kept arriving. The advertising kept going out. Meanwhile, in the places that the advertising did not reach, something was accumulating that had no name and no observer, and would not acquire either for several more years. In the homes of women who had taken Contagan during the early weeks of pregnancy, women who had been told by their doctors that the drug was safe, who had been told by the advertisement that it was safe for pregnant women and nursing mothers, in those homes, in those pregnancies, in the narrow window of the first trimester, when the embryo's limbs were forming from structures as fine and precise as watchwork, the drug was doing something that no test had anticipated, and no physician could see, and no regulatory framework had created the language to describe. A woman takes a tablet on a winter evening somewhere in West Germany. She's in the 5th week of pregnancy. She does not know this yet. The nausea has been bad for 3 days. Her doctor said the drug was safe. The advertisement in the waiting room said the same. She takes the tablet, drinks a glass of water, and goes to bed. The placenta, which she has been told protects her child, does not stop it. The molecule has 2 forms. They are mirror images of each other, the same atoms arranged in the same bonds, but oriented in space the way a left-hand mirrors a right. In chemistry, this is called chirality, from the Greek word for hand, and it matters more than it sounds like it should. 2 molecules that are mirror images of each other can behave completely differently inside a living body, because the proteins they interact with are themselves chiral, and a protein shaped for a left-handed key will not open for a right-handed one. Thalidomide is chiral. One form, the R enantiomer, is a sedative. It binds to the receptors that slow the nervous system, produces drowsiness, allows sleep. The other form, the S enantiomer, does something else entirely. In adults, in the doses used clinically, the S form's effects are subtle enough to be missed. In an embryo in the first weeks of development, they are not subtle at all. The S enantiomer binds to a protein called cereblon. Cereblon, under normal circumstances, is involved in a chain of cellular events that regulate the production of a growth factor called fibroblast growth factor 8. Fibroblast growth factor 8 is one of the signals that tells a developing embryo where its limbs should go and how they should grow. When the S enantiomer binds to cereblon, the chain is disrupted. The signal weakens. The limb that was supposed to form from a structure as fine and temporary as a bud on a twig does not receive the instruction it needs. The thumb fails to form. Then the radius. Then the humerus. The architecture of the arm, built in a sequence as precise as a sentence, stops mid-word. None of this was known in 1958. The protein cereblon would not be identified as thalidomide's primary target until research conducted decades later, using zebrafish and chicken embryos and techniques that did not exist when Contagan was on open sale at the pharmacies of West Germany. What was known, what was knowable, with the tools and frameworks of the late 1950s was essentially nothing. The drug had been tested. It had not killed animals. The conclusion that followed from this, that it was safe, was the conclusion that the available evidence supported. The available evidence was asking the wrong question. There was also a second problem, and it is the one that closes the escape route that hindsight might otherwise suggest. When the 2 enantiomers of thalidomide were eventually separated and studied independently, in the 1970s and beyond, researchers confirmed what they had suspected. The R enantiomer was the one that sedated, and the S enantiomer was the one that destroyed limb development. The obvious response was to ask whether simply administering only the R enantiomer would have prevented the disaster. The answer was no. In the body, in the presence of water and biological fluids, the 2 forms interconvert. A molecule of R thalidomide ingested as a pure compound will convert some portion of itself into S-thalidomide within hours. The body does this spontaneously, without assistance, because the chemical bond connecting the two forms is unstable in aqueous environments. You cannot give a safe version of thalidomide to a pregnant woman and have it remain safe. The molecule will fix that for you. This is the part of the story where the architecture of the catastrophe becomes fully visible. It was not a drug that was dangerous because someone cut corners. It was a drug whose danger was embedded in its molecular structure in a way that the science of the time could not see, and in a way that even later science could not engineer around. The disaster was not waiting to be found by a more careful company. It was waiting to be found by a more advanced century. What the embryo experienced, it experienced in silence and in darkness, and in a window of time so brief that even the woman carrying it usually did not know the window had opened. The critical period, the days during which thalidomide exposure caused limb defects, ran from approximately day 34 to day 50 of pregnancy, counting from the first day of the last menstrual period. In practical terms, this meant the 4th and 5th weeks of gestation. A woman who did not yet know she was pregnant, and many women did not know at 4 weeks, particularly if their cycles were irregular, or if the nausea that drove them to take the drug in the first place had obscured the signs, could take a single tablet during this window and produce damage that would define her child's entire life. Lenz would later report that ingestion of even one tablet during the critical period was sufficient to cause deformities of all 4 limbs. Not probable, sufficient. The geometry of the damage followed the geometry of development. The embryo builds its limbs in sequence from proximal to distal, from the body outward. The thumb forms first, before the hand, before the forearm. When thalidomide interrupted this sequence, the interruption reflected where in the sequence the drug had arrived. A woman who took thalidomide early in the critical window tended to have a child whose arms were entirely absent, the shoulder connecting directly to a hand or to fingers, a condition called phocomelia, from the Greek for seal limb, because the residual structures had the approximate shape and position of a flipper. A woman who took the drug later in the window might have a child whose arms were shortened but present, whose thumbs were missing, whose hands were malformed. The damage was a record of the timing, written in bone. The lower limbs followed the same logic, though they were affected less frequently and less severely. The drug reached the lower limb buds later in the developmental sequence, and the window during which they were vulnerable was narrower. Children born with thalidomide damage to both upper and lower limbs existed, but the child with no arms and intact legs was more common than the reverse. The pattern, once you knew to look for it, was as consistent as a fingerprint. Nobody was looking for it yet. Beyond the limbs, the damage extended into other systems developing during the same window. The ears, specifically the internal structures that translate sound into nerve signals, formed during overlapping days. Children who had been exposed to thalidomide during the critical period were born with missing or malformed ears, with narrowed ear canals, with hearing losses that range from partial to complete. The eyes were affected in some cases, restricted movement, structural damage, reduced vision. The heart, the gastrointestinal tract, the kidneys, the genitalia, all developing during those same weeks, all vulnerable to the disruption of the same signal. A child born with thalidomide damage was often not born with thalidomide damage in one system. The drug had been everywhere the blood went during those days, and the blood had been everywhere. Approximately 40% of infants born with thalidomide-related deformities died within their first year of life, some from cardiac malformations, some from gastrointestinal defects incompatible with feeding, some from the accumulated weight of multiple organ systems compromised simultaneously. The ones who survived carried the full inventory of what the drug had done during those days in the first trimester, not as a diagnosis that would fade or a condition that would be treated into remission, but as the permanent architecture of their bodies. Through the late 1950s, this was happening without a name. Doctors delivering affected babies were confronted with presentations they had never seen before, or had seen only very rarely. phocomelia was considered so uncommon that many physicians had never encountered a case in their entire careers. A German textbook from before the thalidomide era described the condition as occurring in approximately 1 in 4 million births. By 1960, it was occurring in German hospitals at a rate that was impossible to explain by any known mechanism. The initial explanations that circulated in medical circles were the explanations available in the absence of the correct one. Nuclear testing was a popular candidate. Radioactive fallout from atmospheric tests had been a subject of growing public concern throughout the decade, and it was not implausible that radiation might be affecting fetal development in ways not yet understood. Viral infection was another theory. Genetic mutation was another. The idea that a pharmaceutical compound, sold legally in pharmacies, prescribed by physicians, marketed explicitly to pregnant women as safe, could be systematically destroying the limbs of their children. This idea was not at the front of anyone's thinking, because the regulatory framework that might have put it there had not been built. There were signals. In retrospect, there were always signals. The Christmas baby in 1956, born without ears to the Grunenthal employee, was a signal. The neuritis reports that began reaching the company in 1959, the peripheral nerve damage in adult long-term users, the tingling in the hands, the difficulty walking, were a signal of a different kind, pointing not at the fetus but at the nervous system, suggesting that the drug was doing something in the nervous system that the animal test had not captured. And there were, scattered through the German medical literature, isolated reports of unusual birth outcomes in women who had used Contergan. A paediatrician named Carl Beck published a newspaper article in May of 1958 suggesting that nuclear tests might be responsible for the increase in malformed births in Germany, which was wrong about the cause but correct about the observation. Something was increasing. The signals were not connected. They were in different places, written in different languages, noticed by different people who did not know the others existed. There was no system for connecting them, no adverse event database, no international pharmacovigilance network, no mechanism by which a case report from a hospital in Hamburg might find its way to a researcher in Sydney who had noticed a similar case last Thursday. Medicine in the late 1950s was organised locally, reported slowly, and synthesised not at all. The information that would eventually damn thalidomide was accumulating in case notes and memory, and unpublished observation across 46 countries simultaneously, and it was accumulating in a system that had no way to add it up. This is worth holding for a moment, because it is the part of the story that is easiest to misread. The standard narrative of pharmaceutical disaster reaches for villains, the company that knew, the regulators who looked away, the system that chose profit over safety. And with thalidomide there are elements of all of those things, particularly as the story develops. But in the late 1950s, in the years when the damage was being done, the failure was not primarily one of concealment or negligence. It was one of architecture. The world did not have the infrastructure to see what was happening. There was no reporting system that would have collected the case notes from Hamburg and compared them to the case notes from Dusseldorf and flagged that both paediatricians had described the same presentation in infants whose mothers had taken the same drug. There was no early warning mechanism. There was no standard protocol for what a physician should do when a patient asked whether a medication was safe to take during pregnancy, beyond consulting the manufacturer's data, which said it was. The physicians were not failing their patients. The system was not failing its mandate. The system had been built without a particular component, and the absence of that component was invisible until the component was needed. And by the time it was needed, the cost of its absence was already written into the bodies of 10,000 children who had not yet been born. At Grunenthal by 1959, the neuritis reports were still arriving, and the advertising was still going out. The company had chosen its interpretation of the evidence. It was not looking for a different one. Meanwhile, in the households of the women who had taken it, the babies were being born. The first wave arrived in the delivery rooms of West Germany through 1958 and 1959. presented by midwives who had never seen anything like what they were seeing, received by paediatricians who reached for their textbooks and found that the textbooks offered no frame for this: phocomelia, a condition so rare it barely existed in the literature, now appearing in hospital after hospital, in city after city, always in the same form, always with the same geometry. The upper limbs most severely affected, the lower limbs less so, the ears sometimes missing, the internal organs sometimes compromised, the child alive and crying and entirely unprepared for the world it entered, as was everyone else in the room. The paediatric textbooks of the era described phocomelia as occurring in approximately 1 in 4 million births. In 1958, that number was no longer accurate anywhere in West Germany, but nobody had assembled the numbers yet to know it. Each hospital was managing its own shock. A paediatrician in Cologne who had delivered 2 affected infants in a calendar year had no way of knowing that his colleague in Munich had delivered 3. The cases were being recorded, in notes, in files, in the careful language of clinical documentation, but they were being recorded separately, locally, in systems that did not speak to each other. The mothers were asked whether anything had been different about the pregnancy, whether they had taken any medications. Many had. Many named Contagon. But many others had not taken it, or did not remember taking it, or had taken it under a different trade name and did not connect the name to the drug. Some had taken it so briefly, 1 or 2 tablets during a particularly bad week of nausea before the morning sickness improved and they stopped, that they did not think of it as having taken medication at all. The pattern was there, consistent, almost mechanical in its regularity. Exposure during weeks 4 and 5, deformities of this specific kind, in this specific sequence. But patterns in medicine require systematic collection to become visible, and systematic collection was not happening. Each case arrived as an individual tragedy. The individual tragedies were not being added up. At the same time, the drug was expanding into new markets. 1959 was a good year for Grunenthal. Sales were strong, the international licensing deals were producing revenue, and the medical profession in West Germany had absorbed Contagan into routine practice, with the thoroughness that comes when a product simply works. Patients slept. Physicians were satisfied. The neuritis reports were a nuisance, but nuisances were manageable. The birth defect reports, such as they were, scattered, individual, not yet reaching the company in any organised form, were not yet registering as a category. They were individual tragedies, regrettable and unconnected. The company had tested the drug. The drug was safe. The individual tragedies were something else. Somewhere in West Germany, another woman is reading the advertisement in her doctor's waiting room. The one that promised the drug was safe. She has been sick every morning for 2 weeks. She does not yet know that the pattern has already started, that the rooms of German hospitals are already containing what it will eventually produce, that the file that was not opened on Christmas morning of 1956 is in some sense still not open. She takes a number from the receptionist and waits for her name to be called. On August 1st, 1960, Frances Kelsey walked into a prefabricated government building in Washington, D.C., and started her first day at the Food and Drug Administration. It was hot, as Washington is in August, and the building was not glamorous, as government buildings in Washington rarely are, and the job she was starting was the kind of job that, under normal circumstances, nobody outside the pharmaceutical industry would ever have heard of. Frances Kelsey reviewed drug applications. That was the work. A pharmaceutical company that wanted to sell a new drug in the United States was required by law to submit an application to the FDA. The application contained the company's evidence that the drug was safe. A reviewer read the application, assessed the evidence, and either approved it or requested more information. The law gave the FDA 60 days to act. If the 60 days elapsed without a formal rejection, the drug went to market automatically. The applications that arrived in 1960 were not voluminous by later standards. A few pages of test results, some physician testimonials, perhaps a graph or 2. The job of the reviewer was to read them, and in most cases sign off. Kelsey was not new to pharmacology. She had earned a PhD in the subject from the University of Chicago in 1938, the first woman to receive that degree from that department, had worked for years as a researcher and editor, had taught at the University of South Dakota, and had come to Washington with her husband, also a pharmacologist, when they both found positions in the capital. She had a particular interest in the mechanisms by which drugs cause harm, which was not a glamorous specialty but turned out to be the right one. Her path to Chicago had itself involved a small piece of the kind of bureaucratic comedy that tends to look more significant in retrospect. When she applied to the pharmacology department as a prospective graduate student, she signed with her initials F. Oldham, as was her habit, and the department head, assuming from those initials that the applicant was male, wrote back offering admission and a research assistantship. When Kelsey arrived and the department discovered she was a woman, the offer was not rescinded. The head of the department, a man named Eugene Geiling, apparently decided that someone who had earned the admission had earned the admission. Geiling would later become one of the most consequential figures in FDA history, and he would eventually be the person who recruited Kelsey to the agency. But in 1937, he was her dissertation supervisor, and the project he assigned her was to investigate a pharmaceutical crisis that was just then killing people across the United States. The crisis was sulfanilamide. A drug company in Tennessee had dissolved the antibiotic sulfanilamide in diethylene glycol, a compound used, among other things, as antifreeze, to produce a liquid formulation that would be easier for children to swallow. Diethylene glycol is poisonous. The company had not tested the formulation for toxicity because no law required them to. More than 100 people, many of them children, died. Kelsey worked on the biochemical investigation of how the compound destroyed kidneys. She was 23 years old, and it was her first serious encounter with the distance between what a pharmaceutical company believed about its product and what the product actually did. The disaster produced the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938, the legislation that created the FDA's drug approval requirement, and was now, 22 years later, the legal framework within which Kelsey was reviewing Richardson Merrill's application. She had been present, in a junior capacity, at the birth of the system she was now administering. She understood what it was for because she understood what had happened in its absence. 1 month into her new job, in September of 1960, an application landed on her desk. It was from a Cincinnati company called Richardson Merrill, and it was for a drug called Kevedon. Kevedon was the American trade name for thalidomide. The drug had been on the market in Europe and elsewhere for 3 years. It was, according to the application, safe. Richardson Merrill expected approval within 60 days. They planned to launch by the spring of 1961. The application was, by the standards of the time, a normal one. Physician testimonials reporting positive experiences, data from Grunenthal's animal trials showing the impossibility of producing a lethal dose, marketing materials describing the drug's safety profile. Richardson Merrill had every reason to expect that the application would be processed and approved, and that by the following spring, American physicians would be prescribing thalidomide to the same range of patients who were already taking it in 46 other countries. The drug was already a success. The American market was simply the next step. Kelsey read the application and found it insufficient. Not dramatically, not in the way of a document that screams its inadequacy, but in the specific methodological way that a trained pharmacologist recognizes when the data is not doing what it claims to be doing. The physician testimonials contained no scientific methodology. They were accounts of clinical experience, which is not the same as evidence. The authors of several cited papers were names she recognized from other contexts. Researchers whose work she'd reviewed for the Journal of the American Medical Association and found, in some cases, to be of questionable reliability, and the application said nothing about the chirality of thalidomide, nothing about the molecular structure of the compound, nothing about whether the company had characterized the enantiomers, nothing about whether the safe and unsafe forms had been distinguished. This was not a trivial omission. For a drug that was going to be prescribed to enormous numbers of people, the molecular identity of what was being prescribed was a basic question. She sent the application back as incomplete. This reset the 60-day clock. Richardson Merrill submitted additional information. Kelsey found it insufficient. She sent it back again. The company submitted more. She reviewed it, identified additional gaps, and returned it. The 60-day window reset with each return. Over the following 18 months, this happened 4 times. Richardson Merrill made approximately 50 visits to the FDA offices in Washington to discuss the application in person. Their representative, in correspondence that became increasingly pointed as the months passed, told Kelsey that she was being unreasonable, that the drug was already proven safe by 3 years of use in more than 20 countries, that her request for additional data were bureaucratic obstruction dressed in the language of scientific caution, that other reviewers at the FDA had examined the file and found nothing objectionable in it, that she was, in short, a new employee who had not yet understood how the process was supposed to work. The process was supposed to work by signing off on applications that were substantially complete and represented products that had demonstrated safety. By that standard, Kelsey's handling of the Kivadon application was anomalous. The drug had an extensive clinical record in Europe. The animal data showed no toxicity at any dose. The physician testimonials were consistent and positive. The application was not obviously deficient in the way that applications sometimes were. It was not missing pages or omitting required sections. Its problems were subtler, and subtler problems were harder to defend. In conversations with company representatives who were accustomed to the normal pace of the approval process than obvious ones. Kelsey's supervisors were receiving complaints. They reviewed her reasoning, they supported her position. What she kept returning to, through the formal requests and the company visits and the letters characterising her as a petty bureaucrat, was the neurological report. The British observation of peripheral neuropathy in adult users was not, she acknowledged, definitive evidence of anything. A single report of nerve damage in long-term users could have many explanations, but it pointed at a mechanism. It said, this drug is doing something in the nervous system, and if it was doing something in the nervous system of adults who had been taking it for months, then the animal tests, which had measured acute toxicity, the ability to kill, had not captured what the drug was doing in living neurological tissue over time, which meant the picture the tests had provided was incomplete, which meant the safety claim was based on an incomplete picture. That reasoning was not complicated. It was, she later said, more instinct than analysis in the early months. A sense that the gaps in the application were pointing at something, that the absence of certain data was itself informative, that a drug prescribed to pregnant women required a higher standard of evidence than the application was providing. She could not prove the drug was dangerous. She had never claimed she could. What she could demonstrate was that the evidence in front of her did not prove it was safe, not for fetuses, not for the developing nervous system, not for the population that the British advertisement had promised could take it without adverse effect on mother or child. The company's position was that the absence of reported harm in Europe was effectively evidence of safety. The drug had been taken by millions of people, and the hospitals had not filled with victims. The argument was not unreasonable on its face. Kelsey's response was that the absence of a connected reporting system in Europe, no systematic tracking of outcomes, no mechanism for linking a birth defect in one hospital to a birth defect in another, meant that harm could be occurring without being organised into the form that would make it visible. The absence of reported harm was not the same as the absence of harm. It was the absence of a system capable of reporting it. This was, she could not have known, precisely correct. What had caught her attention, beyond the methodology problems, was a report from Britain. A British medical journal had published observations of peripheral neuropathy in long-term adult users of thalidomide, nerve damage in the hands and feet, tingling and numbness, difficulty walking. The report was not definitive. It was a clinical observation, the kind of early signal that might or might not indicate a real effect. but it interested Kelsey because of the mechanism it implied. If the drug was affecting the peripheral nervous system of adults, it was doing something in the nervous system that the animal tests had not detected, which meant the animal tests were not a complete picture of what the drug did in living tissue, which meant that the claim of absolute safety of a drug that animals could not be killed with was not the same as a claim that the drug was neutral in all biological systems at all doses and in all populations. And if the drug was crossing biological barriers that the animal test had not explored, the question that followed was obvious. What other barriers was it crossing? What other systems was it affecting? What happened when a nervous system was not fully formed, when it was in fact in the process of forming, in the specific and irreplaceable window during which it could not be reformed if something went wrong? Kelsey raised this question in her correspondence with Richardson Merrill. She asked for animal studies demonstrating that the drug would not harm the developing fetus. The company told her this request was excessive, that no such standard existed, that the drug had been prescribed to pregnant women in Europe for years without incident. She noted that the absence of reported incidents was not the same as the absence of incidents. She asked for the studies. Richardson Merrill did not provide them, because Richardson Merrill did not have them, because Grunenthal had not run them, because nobody had required anyone to run them. Instead, the company submitted what it had, which was the original Grunenthal data, and Kelsey reviewed it again and returned it again. The relationship between Kelsey and the company's representative had, by this point, become openly adversarial. The representative had written to her supervisors describing her as a petty bureaucrat who was preventing a legitimate product from reaching American patients who needed it. He had characterized her as someone who was allowing personal caution to override scientific consensus. He had implied, in language that stopped just short of saying it directly, that the real problem was that she was a new employee who had not yet learned her place. She had, by this point, a fairly settled sense of her place. What Kelsey was doing was not, she later acknowledged, the product of certainty. She could not prove the drug was dangerous. She had no data showing that thalidomide harmed fetuses. She had an absence of data showing that it did not, and a neurological signal in adults that suggested the drug was more biologically active than its toxicity profile, implied, and a professional instinct, the kind that forms over decades of thinking carefully about how drugs cause harm, that the gaps in the application were the kind of gaps that, once filled, might not produce the answers the company was expecting. She kept returning the application. Her supervisors kept backing her. Outside her office window, the situation in Europe was developing in ways she did not yet know. The first reports of unusual birth defect clusters in West Germany were beginning to reach the attention of paediatricians who were starting to ask systematic questions. The pattern that Widukind-Lenz would eventually identify was accumulating in case notes across German hospitals. 41 mothers out of 46, all of them Contagon users, all of them with Fokker-Mellick infants. The Australian midwife Sister Pat Sparrow was beginning to notice something similar in the ward at Crown Street Women's Hospital in Sydney. None of this had yet reached a form that anyone was reporting internationally. The medical community of the early 1960s communicated through journals that took months to publish, through conferences that happened annually, through letters between colleagues who happened to know each other. The information that would vindicate Kelsey was on its way to her, but it was travelling through systems built for a slower world. In the meantime, Richardson Merrill had found a different route. Under existing regulations, a pharmaceutical company was permitted to distribute a drug to physicians as an experimental sample, as long as the packaging was labelled experimental. No FDA approval was required for this. The intent of the provision was to allow physicians to gain familiarity with drugs that were moving through the approval process, so that they would be prepared to prescribe effectively once the approval was granted. It was a reasonable provision in a world where the approval process was assumed to be a formality. Richardson Merrill used it to distribute thalidomide to approximately 20,000 American patients, while Kelsey was still reviewing the formal application. The distribution was extensive and largely untracked. Samples went to more than 1,000 physicians in cities across the country. The physicians, in many cases, did not understand that the drug had not been approved. They had received it through a process that looked like the standard sample distribution any pharmaceutical representative might conduct, and the word experimental on the packaging was not presented to them with any particular emphasis. Patients received the drug from their doctors in the context of what appeared to be ordinary medical care. Many were not told it was experimental. Some were not told what drug they were taking at all, only that it would help with their symptoms. Informed consent, as a clinical standard, did not yet have the legal weight it would acquire after the events that followed. Among the 20,000 patients were pregnant women. Several had been specifically prescribed the drug for morning sickness, the very application for which the British advertisement had promised complete safety. By the time the FDA situation resolved itself, 17 of those women had given birth to children with confirmed thalidomide-related deformities. Dozens more were suspected but could not be confirmed, because the tracking Richardson Merrill had maintained was incomplete, in ways that made retrospective analysis difficult. The company had not recorded which patients received experimental samples with the rigour that would have allowed a systematic assessment of outcomes. This was not illegal. It was simply how experimental distribution worked in a regulatory environment that had not yet decided it needed to work differently. Kelsey did not know the extent of the distribution while it was happening. The formal application was the limit of her visibility. She continued to review it, to identify gaps, to request additional data, to return it as incomplete. She continued to receive visits from Richardson Merrill's representative. She continued to absorb his characterization of her as a bureaucratic obstruction in possession of excessive caution and insufficient experience. She continued to note that the 60 days had reset and that the application was still incomplete, and that the data she had asked for had still not arrived. What she could not have known, what nobody in Washington knew yet as November of 1961 arrived, was that in a pediatric clinic in Hamburg, a geneticist named Witty had just finished reviewing a set of case records that had caused him, on the evening of November 11th, to sit very still and think about what he was looking at. 41 of 46 mothers of phocomelic infants had taken Contagon during early pregnancy. He'd spent an extended weekend on those records. He knew what they said. He was not yet certain he was ready to say it. He picked up the phone 5 days later. Witty was a pediatrician and human geneticist based in Hamburg, and in the autumn of 1961 he was not looking for a drug. He was looking for a cause. The cluster of children he had been tracking through the Hamburg clinic presented in a way that was consistent enough to be unsettling and inconsistent enough to resist easy explanation. Phocomelia, the severe shortening or absence of the limb structures, the hands and feet projecting from the shoulders and hips as though the intervening bones had simply been omitted, was appearing in numbers that bore no relationship to the historical rate. A condition that German medical textbooks described as occurring perhaps once in 4 million births was occurring in Hamburg hospitals multiple times in a single year. The children were born alive, many of them healthy in every respect apart from the architecture of their limbs. They cried normally, fed when fed, responded to the world around them. Their deformities were not random. They followed a pattern. The pattern was in the geometry of it. The upper limbs more severely affected than the lower. The thumb, the first structure to be absent, then the radius, then the humerus. The arm built in the wrong direction, or not built at all from the body outward. The ears missing or malformed in some cases. The eyes affected in others. The internal organs occasionally compromised in ways that were not visible from the outside and became apparent only in the days and weeks after birth. The children who survived their first year carried the full inventory. The ones who did not, approximately 40%, died of cardiac malformations or gastrointestinal defects that could not sustain life, conditions hidden inside otherwise apparently healthy newborns. Lenz had been interviewing the parents of these children through the autumn, asking about everything: diet during pregnancy, illness, environmental exposures, the neighbourhood, the water, the occupation of the father, whether there had been any contact with chemicals or radiation or any substance that might have reached the embryo during the first trimester. He was asking about nuclear testing. The theory that atmospheric fallout from weapons tests was affecting fetal development had been circulating in German medical circles and was not implausible on its face. He was asking about viral infections. He was asking systematically about medications, what the mother had taken during the first trimester, what her doctor had prescribed, what she might have taken without a prescription from a pharmacy for any symptom at all, headache, insomnia, nausea, anxiety, anything. On November 8th, 1961, Lenz wrote to a colleague that medication did not seem a probable cause. He was still working through the full range and had not found, in the data available to him at that point, a signal strong enough to prioritize any single explanation. 3 days later, having spent what he later described as an extended weekend reviewing a larger set of case records, the range had collapsed to a point. 41 of the 46 mothers of phocomelic infants in his investigation had taken a thalidomide preparation during early pregnancy. He checked the number again. He checked it in different ways, looking for the methodological error that would explain it, the confounding factor that would dissolve the association into coincidence. The association did not dissolve. Contagon was widely used in West Germany, widely enough that a high rate of use among any group of pregnant women was not by itself surprising, but 90% was not wide use. 90% was a pattern with the specificity of a fingerprint. He was certain enough by November 16th to phone Grunenthal directly. The call was not, by the accounts of those familiar with it, a comfortable one. Lenz told the company what he'd found. He told them his conclusion. He told them that he believed the drug needed to come off the market while the investigation continued, and the findings were prepared for publication. Grunenthal's response was to say that a retrospective case review was not controlled evidence, that association was not causation, that the company had conducted safety tests that showed no such effect, and that withdrawing a product with a clean safety record on the basis of an incomplete investigation would be premature. Lenz presented at a pediatric conference in Düsseldorf on November 18th. The room received the data with the quality of silence that follows the announcement of something that has already changed what comes next, even before anyone has said so explicitly. He had 41 of 46. The ratio was holding. It would continue to hold as the investigation extended. As more cases were added to the count, the proportion of mothers who had taken thalidomide did not weaken toward coincidence. It strengthened. Public health officials in West Germany, who'd been receiving not only Lenz's reports but scattered reports from other physicians who'd arrived at similar suspicions through independent routes, informed Grunenthal that if the company did not withdraw the drug voluntarily, a formal ban would be imposed. This is the conversation that produced the withdrawal, not the phone call on November 16th, not the conference on November 18th, not the wait of 41 mothers in 46, the threat of a ban. On November 26, 1961, Chemie Grunenthal withdrew Contagon from the West German market. The withdrawal was announced without the company acknowledging that the drug had caused any harm. Their public statement described the decision as precautionary. The language was careful, lawyerly, and would remain the template for Grunenthal's public communications about thalidomide for the next half-century. The British withdrawal followed on December 2nd. The Distillers Company, which had been receiving the same reports from the same networks, removed Distaval from UK pharmacies and from the Australian and New Zealand markets it supplied. The speed of the British withdrawal, once the evidence arrived, was notably faster than the German response. The Distillers Company did not wait for a regulatory threat. It withdrew. On December 16, 1961, a short letter appeared in The Lancet, the British medical journal. It was from a gynecologist in Sydney named William McBride, and it noted in the restrained language of clinical correspondence that he had observed a disturbing pattern among his patients at Crown Street Women's Hospital, an unusual number of infants born with severe limb deformities, whose mothers had taken thalidomide for morning sickness during early pregnancy. McBride estimated that approximately 1 in 5 of his patients who had taken the drug gave birth to a severely malformed child. He called for urgent investigation. What the brief Lancet letter did not record was the preceding months of observation and resistance that had produced it. McBride had not arrived at the connection alone or all at once. The first person to notice the pattern at Crown Street was a midwife named Sister Pat Sparrow, who had been delivering babies on the ward and had begun to register, with the specific attentiveness of someone whose entire professional life is organised around noticing what is and is not normal in a newborn, that the clustering of limb deformities among her patients was not random. She brought her observations to McBride. He investigated. He examined the case records of the affected infants and interviewed their mothers and found the pattern she had found. He contacted the Australian representatives of distillers and reported his concerns, not in December, not after the German withdrawal, but in June of 1961, 5 months before the European withdrawal, 5 months before Lentz made his phone call to Grunenthal. McBride had found what Lentz had found, from the other side of the world, through a route that had begun with a midwife paying attention on a maternity ward. The two men did not know each other. They had not compared notes. They had followed the same evidence independently to the same conclusion, using the same method, interviewing mothers, reviewing records, counting the cases and asking what they had in common. The Australian representatives of distillers received McBride's concerns in June of 1961. The documentary record of what happened to those concerns in the following 5 months is incomplete and contested. What is clear is that the drug continued to be sold in Australia until December of that year, when distillers withdrew it from the British market and the Australian and New Zealand markets it supplied followed simultaneously. The 5 months between McBride's first report and the eventual withdrawal added to a count that was already catastrophic. From opposite sides of the world working independently, without knowledge of each other's investigations until the final weeks of 1961, Lentz and McBride had found the same thing. The pattern was not a German pattern or an Australian pattern. It was a thalidomide pattern. It had the same geometry, the same timing, the same relationship between the week of exposure and the type of deformity, whether the mother had taken Contergan in Hamburg, or Distaval in Sydney, or Softenon in the Netherlands, or any of the other 30-odd names under which the same molecule had been sold across 46 countries. The withdrawal cascade that followed the November and December announcements was not uniform, and it was not fast everywhere. It was fast in some places and unconscionably slow in others, and the difference was measured in children. Canada continued selling thalidomide for approximately 3 months after the German withdrawal. The Canadian regulatory authorities had received the same reports that were circulating internationally. They withdrew the drug in March of 1962. The children born in Canada during those 3 months to mothers who took the drug after Germany had already pulled it represent a category of damage that had a specific human cause. Not the absence of scientific infrastructure, not the invisible gap between what was known and what was assumed, but the delay of a regulatory decision in the presence of available evidence. Other countries were slower still, for reasons that would take years to fully account for, and the accounting would not be complete for decades. Back in Washington, the news from Europe reached France's Kelsey, through the same channels it was reaching everyone else: the medical journals, the wire services, the international correspondence networks of the pharmaceutical regulatory community. In March of 1962, Richardson Merrill withdrew their FDA application. They did not announce this as a concession. They announced it as a response to the new information from Europe, as though the new information were the reason the application had not been straightforward from the beginning, as though 18 months of return submissions and 50 office visits had been the company's own idea. Kelsey filed the withdrawal. The application was closed. The drug was never approved for sale in the United States. In July of 1962, a reporter for the Washington Post named Morton Mintz published a front-page article about what had almost happened. The article described the thalidomide disaster in Europe, described the Richardson-Merrill application and its 18-month history, and named Frances Kelsey as the person whose refusal to approve an incomplete application had kept the United States out of the catastrophe. The article called her a heroine. Mintz later estimated that her intervention had prevented the births of hundreds, or perhaps thousands, of armless and legless children. That estimate is not provable with precision. The American market, the size of the anticipated launch, the likely reach of the drug through physician samples and prescription. But it is not unreasonable. For a comparison, West Germany, with a smaller population than the United States, had seen more than 5,000 affected births. The American market for sedatives was large, and the drug's marketing had been preparing it for a national launch. Kelsey herself was characteristically modest about the framing. She pointed to her colleagues, her assistant Jiro Oyama, the pharmacologist Lee Geismar, the FDA supervisors who had backed her position against the company's complaints, and said the credit was not hers alone. She was correct that the decision had not been made in isolation. She was less forthcoming about the fact that without the specific quality of attention she had brought to an application that everyone around her had expected to be routine, none of the colleagues she credited would have had anything to back. The scale of what this prevented becomes visible only in comparison with what happened everywhere else. More than 10,000 children born with severe deformities across 46 countries, 40% of them dead before their first birthday, the survivors carrying the full inventory of what 5 weeks in the first trimester had produced: absent arms, malformed ears, compromised hearts, bodies built around what the drug had opened in a developmental window too brief for anyone to have known to watch for it. The Washington Post article gave Americans a story about a heroine who had saved them from this. The story was true. It was also, in its clean heroism, slightly misleading. What had saved the United States was not Frances Kelsey's courage, though she had shown courage. It was the specific and unrepeatable fact of her assignment that a reviewer with her particular background, her particular instincts about nervous system pharmacology, her particular reluctance to accept the absence of evidence as evidence of safety, had happened to be sitting at the desk when that specific application arrived, in her first month on the job, and had found it insufficient in ways that she could not fully articulate and could not stop finding. In August of 1962, President John F. Kennedy awarded Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service, the highest honor available to a civilian federal employee. She was the second woman ever to receive it. She stood in a ceremony next to Senator Estes Kefauver, who held a bottle of thalidomide for the photographers, and she accepted the medal with a particular self-possession of someone who does not entirely believe the occasion is warranted, but understands that declining it would be impolite. She went back to work the following Monday. There were other applications on her desk. By the time the full picture assembled itself, through the conference reports and the Lancet letters and the international correspondence that moved slowly between the regulatory bodies of 46 countries, the disaster had a shape. It was not the shapeless catastrophe that most disasters appear to be from inside them. It had borders, it had edges, and the edges, when you looked at them carefully, were not where you would expect the edges of a natural event to be. The map of thalidomide damage tracked almost exactly onto the map of thalidomide distribution. Countries that had approved the drug had affected children. Countries that had not approved it did not. This was not surprising on its own. It would have been surprising if the opposite were true. What was surprising? What was the detail that kept arriving in accounts of the disaster and refusing to be absorbed as merely coincidental? Was the precision of a single border. West Germany had thousands of affected children. Thousands! The country where the drug had been developed, where it had gone on sale without a prescription in October of 1957, where an estimated 1 million people had been taking it daily by 1959, where 300 million tablets had been sold. West Germany had more cases of thalidomide-related phocomelia than anywhere else on Earth, in numbers that would not be precisely established for years because the infrastructure for counting them had not existed while they were accumulating. East Germany had none, not fewer, not a reduced number consistent with lower market penetration or a more cautious prescribing culture. None. The epidemic of limb deformities that had swept through the hospitals of Hamburg and Dusseldorf and Cologne and Munich had stopped, with the completeness of a sentence ending, at the Iron Curtain. On one side of a political boundary, thousands of children born without arms. On the other side of the same boundary, in the same country speaking the same language, eating the same food, breathing the same air. No such children. The deformities stopped at a line on a map that had been drawn by the outcomes of a war and maintained by the competing interests of two superpowers, and they stopped there because East Germany's Central Committee of Experts for Drug Traffic had looked at the thalidomide application in the mid-1950s and said no. They had not said no because they knew something West Germany did not know. They had not run tests that Grünthal had avoided or consulted science that the Western regulatory apparatus had ignored. Their data was the same data. Their scientific framework was the same framework. The catastrophe-generating gap in the architecture of pharmaceutical testing. The absence of any requirement to test drugs on pregnant animals. The non-existence of teratology as a discipline with standard methods. The assumption that the placental barrier provided protection that had never been verified existed on both sides of the Iron Curtain equally. East Germany simply said no. The reasons were not published in detail. A committee applied whatever criteria it was working with, found the application insufficient, and moved to the next item. The no saved every child who would otherwise have been born in East Germany with thalidomide damage. The no was not the product of superior wisdom or more careful science. It was the product of a bureaucratic decision made for reasons that were neither heroic nor particularly well informed. It was, in the most structurally precise sense, an accident of caution. A committee doing its ordinary work at its ordinary pace, without any awareness that the decision it was making would prove to be the most consequential pharmaceutical regulatory decision made anywhere in the world during the 1950s. This is the fact that sits at the centre of the thalidomide story, and does not move regardless of how many times you look at it from different angles. The damage was not the product of ignorance in the sense of unavoidability. It was the product of a specific answer, yes, given in specific places, by specific regulatory bodies, under specific conditions that made yes the path of least resistance. Everywhere the answer was yes, children were harmed in proportion to how widely the drug reached pregnant women. Everywhere the answer was no, for whatever reason, under whatever logic, out of whatever institutional instinct, they were not. The question this raises is not comfortable, and the story does not resolve it comfortably. If the disaster was the product of a yes that could have been a no, then it was not inevitable. It was not the price of ignorance in the pure sense, the kind of harm that could not have been avoided by any decision available at the time. It was the price of decisions, made by real institutions, with real alternatives in front of them, even if those alternatives were not clearly labelled as alternatives. East Germany selected its alternative by accident, without knowing it was selecting anything of consequence. The outcome it produced was the outcome that everyone in West Germany would have preferred. The outcomes were not equivalent. The decisions were not equivalent. And yet the decision-makers on both sides were working from the same available knowledge. And the knowledge was genuinely insufficient, and the gap between the knowledge and what the situation required was not a gap anyone had yet built the tools to close. This is what the compass means, and part 6 is where it lands most directly. The tragedy was not that people ignored warnings. The warnings did not exist, not in any form that the regulatory systems of the time were designed to receive and act on. But the disaster was also, precisely, the shape of what happened when those systems were asked a question they had not built themselves to answer. The system answered as well as it could with what it had. What it had was not enough. East Germany's system answered no for reasons unrelated to the question. Both answers produced outcomes. The outcomes were not equivalent, and the gap between them, between what happened in West Germany and what did not happen across the border is the gap that the next 50 years of pharmaceutical regulation would spend itself trying to fill. The Iron Curtain comparison is the starkest illustration of this, but it was not the only one. The shape of the disaster was the shape of the regulatory decisions made about the drug in every country where it was sold, and in each case the contours of the damage reflected the contours of those decisions with the fidelity of a photograph. Austria and Switzerland present a gentler version of the same logic. In both countries, thalidomide had been approved for sale, but a member of the Austrian Pharmaceutical Admission Conference named Ingeborg Eichler had enforced its classification as a prescription-only medication rather than an over-the-counter one. This meant that in Austria and Switzerland, a patient could not simply walk into a pharmacy and purchase Contagon or its equivalent without a physician's involvement. The physician's involvement created a layer of filtering, not a reliable one, not a layer that prevented all prescriptions to pregnant women, but a layer that reduced the volume of exposure compared to markets where the drug was available without restriction. The affected children born in Austria and Switzerland were far fewer than those born in West Germany, not because the drug was less dangerous there, but because fewer pregnant women had taken it. Canada illustrates a different edge of the same shape. Canada had approved thalidomide and was selling it when the German withdrawal occurred in November of 1961. Canada continued selling it for approximately 3 months afterward. The international reports were available. The Lentz findings had been presented at Dusseldorf, reported in the German medical press, communicated through the channels that connected regulatory bodies across the developed world. Canada's regulatory authorities were not ignorant of what was happening in Germany. They were deliberate. They were moving through a process that had its own timeline and its own internal requirements. By March of 1962, when the Canadian withdrawal occurred, the thalidomide window, that critical span of days 34 to 50, in which a single tablet could restructure a child's development, had opened and closed for a cohort of Canadian mothers who had been prescribed the drug after the rest of the world had stopped prescribing it. Their children were added to the count. Canada's count was already over 150 before the withdrawal. The 3 additional months added to it. Japan's delay was the most consequential after Germany's failure to act on the early neuritis warnings. Thalidomide was sold in Japan as Isomin, manufactured by a Japanese pharmaceutical company, under a licensing arrangement similar to those operating in Europe. The Japanese regulatory system in the early 1960s was not well integrated into the international networks through which the Lenz and McBride findings circulated. The foreign data moved slowly. The domestic process moved through its own procedures. The Japanese withdrawal did not occur until September of 1962, 10 months after Germany, 8 months after most of the rest of the world. The children born in Japan during those 10 months, to mothers who had been prescribed a drug that West Germany had already pulled from its shelves the previous November, number in the hundreds. Approximately 300 Japanese thalidomide survivors are thought to be living as of recent estimates. The 10-month lag is written into each of them. Spain is in a category of its own. The Spanish government did not formally acknowledge that thalidomide had ever been imported into the country until 2008, more than 4 decades after the withdrawal everywhere else. Grunenthal's subsidiary in Spain had marketed the drug, and when the international withdrawal came, the subsidiary had not ensured that Spanish physicians received clear warnings. The state controls on pharmaceutical distribution were poor. The regulatory infrastructure for tracking adverse outcomes was inadequate. And when advocates for Spanish victims began seeking answers in the years that followed, they encountered a government that, for decades, simply denied the facts. The thalidomide advocacy group in Spain estimates that there were approximately 250 to 300 surviving victims as of 2015. Many had spent their entire adult lives without access to the compensation frameworks that had been established in Germany and Britain and Australia, without any official acknowledgement that their country had ever received the drug that had shaped their bodies. The shape of the disaster in each of these cases is the shape of a decision. not the shape of ignorance. The scientific gap that prevented anyone from knowing the drug was harmful before it was approved was a genuine gap, and the people who approved it were not approving something they knew to be dangerous. But the variations in the damage, the difference between West Germany's thousands and East Germany's zero, between Austria's cautious hundreds and Germany's uncountable thousands, between Japan's 10-month lag and Britain's relatively prompt December withdrawal, those variations are the shapes of decisions, of timelines, of bureaucratic processes that moved at different speeds through the same available evidence. Francis Kelsey's handling of the FDA application fits into this map as perhaps its most extreme data point. The United States had 17 confirmed thalidomide-damaged births, all from the unregulated sample distribution that Richardson Merrill had conducted in parallel with the formal application. The formal application, the one that would have brought the drug to American pharmacies, to American physicians, to American pregnant women in the numbers that a national launch would have reached, never received approval. Not because American science was better, not because the American regulatory framework was more rigorous, but because the specific reviewer assigned to the specific application on a specific September morning in 1960 had found the data insufficient and had continued to find it insufficient for a year and a half. The map of thalidomide damage is, in this sense, also a map of thalidomide luck, the luck of East Germany's committee, the luck of Ingeborg Eichler's enforcement of prescription status in Austria, the luck of Francis Kelsey's assignment. None of these were the products of a system that was reliably generating protective decisions. They were the products of individual decisions that happened, in retrospect, to be correct, made within systems that were not designed to make them reliably, by people who were not acting on the basis of information that would have told them what was at stake. The information about what was at stake was the information that did not yet exist. It was the information that the disaster would eventually produce, at the cost of 10,000 children and everything that followed from their births and their deaths. The information that would be organized into new requirements and new standards and new disciplines that began to be built in the months after the withdrawal from the specific shape of what had failed. What the map shows, finally, is not just where the drug went and what it did. It shows the precise outline of a scientific and regulatory infrastructure that had not been built. The damage filled every space where that infrastructure was absent. It stopped exactly where something, a committee's no, a bureaucrat's standard, a midwife's attention, had happened to stand in its way. The stops were accidental. The infrastructure that would make the stopping reliable was not. The filling began in October of 1962, and it began in the United States, which was in some respects the wrong place for it to begin, since the United States had largely been spared the disaster that made the filling necessary. But the United States had Francis Kelsey, and Francis Kelsey had become, in the summer of 1962, the most famous government employee in the country, and her fame was producing a legislative momentum that Senator Estes Kefauver had been trying to generate for more than 2 years without success. Kefauver had been working on drug regulation reform since before thalidomide was withdrawn anywhere. His concern was not fetal safety. Teratology was not yet a political issue in the United States in 1960. His concern was pharmaceutical pricing and the monopoly power of large drug companies, and the bill he had been trying to pass through a resistant Congress was primarily about patent law and compulsory licensing, with drug efficacy requirements added as a secondary provision. By the summer of 1962, the bill had been stripped of most of its teeth by industry lobbying. The Kennedy administration had withdrawn its support, and Kefauver's colleagues in the Senate had largely concluded that the legislation was dead. Then the Washington Post published its front-page story about Francis Kelsey and thalidomide in July, and the public's appetite for pharmaceutical accountability became, almost overnight, a force that the Senate could not ignore. The Kefauver-Harris drug amendments were passed unanimously by both houses of Congress on October 2, 1962. President Kennedy signed them into law 8 days later, with Francis Kelsey standing in the photograph. What the amendments required was, in retrospect, obvious. So obvious that the fact of their non-existence until that moment requires its own moment of attention. Drug companies, before October of 1962, were required to demonstrate only that their product was not overtly poisonous. The threshold was toxicity. The question being asked was, will this kill someone in the short term? The question not being asked was, does it work? Does it do what the company claims it does? Is it safe for populations beyond the adults in the animal trials? Is it safe for fetuses, for children, for long-term users, for people with conditions the company did not study? After October 10th, 1962, the answer to those questions was required before approval. Drug companies were now obligated to demonstrate efficacy, not just safety from acute toxicity, but effectiveness for the stated indication through adequate and well-controlled investigations, a phrase that the FDA would spend the following decades giving increasing specificity to. They were required to conduct extensive animal testing before human trials, including reproductive toxicity testing, the category that had not existed as a regulatory requirement, and whose absence had made thalidomide's approval possible. They were required to obtain informed consent from participants in clinical trials. The FDA was given authority over the design and monitoring of those trials in ways it had not previously possessed. The automatic 60-day approval window was eliminated. A drug application would now be reviewed and decided on its merits, on whatever timeline the science required, without the default approval that had made Francis Kelsey's management of the Kivadon application a race against a clock. The transformation of the drug application itself, in the years following the amendments, is one of the more concrete measurements of what had changed. Before 1960, a typical new drug application was a few pages, testimonials, a graph or two, a summary of the animal data. By the end of the 1960s, applications had grown to the thickness of several telephone directories, mostly composed of safety testing data that had not previously been required. By the 1990s, a complete new drug application routinely ran to the equivalent of 250 telephone directories. The weight of the paper was the weight of the questions that thalidomide had proved necessary to ask. Kelsey did not step back from this work after the headlines faded. She moved from reviewing new drug applications to heading the FDA's investigational drugs branch, and later led the Division of Scientific Investigations, the unit responsible for overseeing clinical investigators and ensuring the scientific integrity of the data on which the agency's decisions were based. In that role, she helped rewrite the regulations governing informed consent, helped prosecute 16 researchers who had submitted fraudulent data to the FDA, and contributed to the systematic construction of the testing standards that the Kefauver-Harris amendments had mandated but not fully specified. The amendments told the pharmaceutical industry what it had to do. Kelsey and her colleagues spent the following decades working out, in regulatory detail, exactly how to do it. She retired from the FDA in 2012 at the age of 98. The standard history of the agency, as one historian noted, divides neatly into two periods: before thalidomide and after Kelsey. Those questions increased the cost of drug development substantially. They increased the time from discovery to first approval. They made the process slower and more expensive, and in the cases of drugs that might have reached patients sooner under a less rigorous system, the cost was real and affected real people who were waiting. The debate about whether the post-thalidomide regulatory framework was appropriately calibrated, whether it protected too much in some areas, too little in others, whether the balance between caution and access was correctly set, did not resolve itself neatly in the years that followed. It became a permanent feature of the pharmaceutical regulatory landscape, an ongoing argument about trade-offs that does not have a version without trade-offs. The drugs that were not approved because the testing burden was too high. The drugs that were approved and later found harmful despite the testing. The drugs that helped people who would not have been helped under the old system. The thalidomide survivors who were alive and living with the cost of the old system in their bodies, were part of every version of this argument whether they were in the room or not. In West Germany, the response took a different form. The criminal justice system, which had been watching the disaster unfold with the same shock as everyone else, began in 1968 to construct a case against the executives of Chemie Grünenthal responsible for the development and marketing of Contagon. The charges included causing bodily harm and violating pharmaceutical law. The defendants included Heinrich Müchter, the head of research whose wartime experience had secured him the position from which he had overseen the drug's development, and other senior figures in the company's scientific and commercial operations. The accused included Hermann Wirtz Sr., the Nazi Party member who had founded Grünenthal after the war, though Wirtz's participation in the proceedings was almost immediately complicated by claims of illness that proved, over the years, to be a reliable source of scheduling conflicts. The trial ran for 2 years. It was, by the accounts of those who followed it, an extraordinary proceeding, not because of its drama but because of its gradual, visible collapse. The evidentiary challenge was formidable. To secure a criminal conviction, prosecutors needed to prove not merely that thalidomide had caused the birth defects, which the scientific evidence had established beyond reasonable dispute, but that specific individuals within Grünenthal had known of the danger and had continued to market the drug with that knowledge. The neuritis reports, the letters from physicians like Voss, warning the company of peripheral nerve damage in long-term adult users from 1959 onward, the internal documents showing company representatives responding to those reports with advertising rather than investigation, were the prosecution's most significant evidence of knowing conduct. They showed that something was wrong, that the company had been told, and that the company had chosen the interpretation that preserved its product. The internal documents that emerged through the proceedings painted a picture of a company that had, from at least 1959, been aware that Contagon was producing effects in adult users that its animal testing had not captured, and that had managed this awareness through a combination of dismissal, misdirection, and continued marketing. Letters from Dr. Voss in October and November of 1959 described multiple cases of peripheral neuritis clearly. Company responses characterized the evidence as insufficient. Sales representatives were sent to reassure concerned physicians rather than to investigate their concerns. Advertising describing the drug's absolute non-toxicity continued to reach physicians' offices while the neuritis reports sat in company files. This pattern, documented across multiple internal communications, was not the picture of a company that had been caught by a danger it could not have foreseen. It was the picture of a company that had received early warning signals about a drug that was behaving unexpectedly in human tissue, and had chosen, repeatedly, to interpret those signals in the way most favourable to continued commercial operation. What the prosecution could not fully establish, within the strict requirements of German criminal law as it applied to this case, was the specific mental state of specific individuals at specific decision points. The knowledge that a particular executive at a particular moment had concluded that the drug was dangerous and had continued to promote it regardless. The company's defense maintained throughout that the defendants had acted in good faith on the basis of the scientific knowledge available at the time, that the safety testing they had conducted met the standards of the era, and that the specific connection between thalidomide exposure during early pregnancy and phocomelia in newborns had not been knowable before the lens findings in November of 1961. This defense was not entirely false. The scientific gap was real. The absence of teratological testing standards was real. The defense exploited both facts with sufficient persistence that the court, in December of 1970, decided not to continue. The decision to end the trial was made in exchange for a settlement. Grünenthal agreed to contribute to a compensation fund for German victims. The founders and executives of the company walked out of the building without convictions. Hermann Wirtz Sr., who had claimed illness throughout, recovered sufficiently to continue his affairs. Heinrich Müchter, whose oversight of the Contagon program from its development through its marketing had been at the centre of the prosecution's case, was never found criminally responsible for any aspect of it. He died in 1987. The company described the settlement as a way of ensuring that victims received support without the further delay of protracted proceedings. The victims described it differently. The German Compensation Fund established through the 1972 settlement, contributed to jointly by Grünenthal and the German federal government, contained approximately 100 million Deutsche Mark, split equally between the two parties. This was distributed among roughly 3,000 German victims, according to a point system that assessed the severity of each individual's impairment, ranging from 3.5 to 75 points, with financial allocations scaled accordingly. The fund was intended to be sufficient. It was not sufficient. The assumption built into its construction was a normal life expectancy and a stable level of need. Neither assumption held over the following decades in the way the fund's designers had imagined. Outside Germany, the compensation landscape was more fragmented and in most cases considerably worse. International victims had no direct claim against Grünenthal through German proceedings. They were dependent on the national distributors who had sold the drug in their countries, distillers in the United Kingdom, Australia and New Zealand, various national licensees elsewhere, and the willingness of those distributors to settle, which was itself dependent on the willingness of those distributors to acknowledge that their product had caused harm, which proceeded unevenly and reluctantly across different jurisdictions over many years. The United Kingdom's experience became a long and painful public argument about what a pharmaceutical company owed to children its product had damaged. Distillers, which had marketed Distaval with the advertisement promising complete safety to pregnant women, resisted full acknowledgement for years. British thalidomide survivors and their families organised, wrote, lobbied and eventually attracted the attention of the Sunday Times of London, which in the early 1970s launched an investigative campaign that produced some of the most sustained and consequential pharmaceutical journalism in British history. The Sunday Times published the story of the survivors and their inadequate compensation, and it pursued distillers, and eventually distillers settled, not generously and not without continued resistance, but it settled. The Thalidomide Trust was established to administer annual payments to British survivors, funded by distillers and later by its corporate successor Diageo, which inherited the obligation when it absorbed the company in 1997. The payments were modest relative to the damage and were the subject of repeated campaigns for increases over the decades. In 2010, the Departments of Health in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland began paying additional annual health grants to thalidomide survivors in recognition of their growing medical needs. These grants were administered by the Trust and distributed according to the severity of each individual's initial impairment. Grünenthal's public position through all of this held to a consistent line. The tests conducted met the standards of the era. The scientific knowledge needed to foresee the drug's effects on the fetus did not exist in 1957, and the outcomes were deeply regretted. The Australian court proceedings, like the German criminal trial before them, confronted that position with the record the company had accumulated over 5 decades of maintaining it. In Australia, victims spent decades pursuing Grünenthal and its successors through the courts. In July of 2012, an Australian woman named Lynette Rowe, born without limbs after her mother took thalidomide, led a class action lawsuit that resulted in an out-of-court settlement. The Supreme Court of Victoria endorsed a settlement of 89 million Australian dollars to 107 victims in February of 2014. Grünenthal had fought to have the case heard in Germany, where the legal environment would have been more favourable to the company. The Australian court rejected that application. The settlement was paid not by Grünenthal, but by its successors in the distribution chain. Grünenthal itself, for the first 5 decades after the withdrawal, maintained a position that can be summarised as follows. We conducted the tests that were required. We met the standards of our time. The scientific knowledge to predict the drug's effects on the fetus did not exist, and we regret the outcomes. This is a position that is not entirely wrong. The scientific gap was real. The testing standards of 1957 did not include reproductive toxicity. These facts are accurate, and Grünenthal's lawyers were correct to rely on them. What the positioner leads is the neuritis evidence, the reports from 1959 onward, the letters from Dr. Voss, the internal documents showing responses that the court in 1970 had characterised in unfavourable terms, and the 4 months between Lentz's November phone call and the drug's formal withdrawal, during which additional children were born to mothers who were still being prescribed it, and during which the company was still arguing that the evidence did not meet its threshold. In August of 2012, 50 years and 9 months after Contagan was withdrawn from the West German market, Grünenthal's chief executive Harold Stock stood in the company's home city of Stolberg and unveiled a bronze statue. The statue depicted a child, and the company had titled it The Sick Child, a name that the thalidomide survivors' organisations immediately and vigorously objected to, since the people it was intended to represent were not children and had not been children for 50 years and did not consider themselves sick. The name implied, in German, a condition requiring cure, which was not how survivors described themselves or their lives. Stock delivered a speech. In it he said that Grünenthal asked for forgiveness for having remained silent for nearly 50 years, for not having found a way to reach out from human being to human being. He said the company was very sorry. He said the suffering that occurred with Contagan had happened in a world completely different from today, and that the pharmaceutical industry had learned a valuable lesson. He reiterated, as the company had always reiterated, that Grünenthal had met all the clinical standards required at the time. Freddie Asprey had been born in Liverpool without arms or legs after his mother took thalidomide. He was 52 years old when the speech was delivered. He said it was a disgrace that it had taken 50 years. He said he was gobsmacked. He said that for years Grünenthal had insisted they had never done anything wrong and had refused to talk to the victims' organisations at all. He said the apology as such didn't help anyone deal with their everyday life. What the survivors needed, he said, were other things. The other things he meant were financial. Grünenthal had settled in Germany and had paid into a fund that German victims' organisations described as inadequate. It had not settled with survivors in Spain, where the government had declined for decades to acknowledge the drug had even been imported. It had not settled with survivors in many other countries. The apology in Stolberg, offered 50 years late, was offered without additional compensation commitments. The company had apologised. The company had not paid. Ilonka Stebritz, a spokesperson for the Association of Contagan Victims in Germany, said what Freddie Asprey said in different words. The apology, she said, doesn't help us deal with our everyday life. The fund established in 1972 had been calculated on the assumption that its recipients would need support for a normal lifespan and at a stable level of need. The assumption had not held. The survivors were aging. Their needs were not stable. They were increasing. The human body is not designed to compensate indefinitely. The thalidomide survivors had spent their lives developing workarounds, not as a conscious project, but as the ordinary adaptation of people who'd been given different starting conditions and had built their existence around them. A person born without arms who has spent 60 years using their feet and their mouth, and whatever range of motion their particular configuration of damage permitted, has not been living a diminished life. They have been living their life, organised around the body they have, with the efficiency and fluency that comes from 60 years of practice. The workarounds become the way. The adaptations become the architecture. What nobody fully anticipated in the 1970s, when the compensation funds were being established and the life expectancy assumptions were being built into the actuarial tables, was what 60 years of compensation would cost the body doing the compensating. The joints that had carried weight they were not anatomically positioned to carry. The muscles that had been recruited to perform functions for which they were not the primary candidates. The spine that had accommodated decades of asymmetrical loading. The cardiovascular system of a body that had moved through the world in a configuration that required more effort than standard anatomy requires for the same tasks. By the time the thalidomide survivors reached their 50s and 60s, which is to say, by the time the 21st century was well underway, they were experiencing the early onset of conditions that normally arrive later. osteoarthritis in joints that had spent decades performing work they were not designed for, mobility limitations that went beyond what aging alone would have produced, cardiovascular disease at rates that reflected the cumulative physiological cost of a lifetime of compensatory effort. The bodies that had adapted so thoroughly, so fluently, over so many decades, were presenting the bill. This was not a surprise in retrospect. It was a surprise in the sense that nobody had planned for it, because nobody had built a model of what thalidomide survivors' aging would look like, because building such a model would have required following a cohort of severely disabled people from birth through old age with a systematic attention that was not, in the 1970s or 80s or even 90s, being directed at this population. The model that the compensation funds had used was based on average life expectancy and static need. Both assumptions had been wrong, and the wrongness was becoming visible in the bodies of the people the funds were supposed to support. In the United Kingdom, the Thalidomide Trust's distribution of annual payments had been the subject of ongoing negotiation since its establishment. The Department of Health grants, added in 2010 to supplement the trust distributions, were structured with a review period running through April of 2022, a recognition that the need was ongoing and changing, and that the original settlement had not captured it fully. Survivors and their advocates continue to argue that the aggregate support was inadequate relative to the scale of what had been done to them and the scale of what they were now experiencing. The German fund, established in 1972 with approximately 100 million Deutsche Mark, had been supplemented over the years through additional government contributions as the inadequacy of the original amount became apparent. Grunenthal's contributions to German victim support remain the subject of dispute, with survivors' organisations arguing that the company's financial obligation had not been fully met, and Grunenthal maintaining its position that it had contributed what was required. In other countries, the picture was worse. Spanish survivors, estimated at between 250 and 300 individuals as of 2015, had received no compensation from Grunenthal and had spent decades without official acknowledgement that their government had ever imported the drug. In 2008, the acknowledgement finally came, 47 years after the withdrawal. Whether it would be followed by compensation remained, as of the time of these events, unresolved. Japanese survivors, organised through advocacy groups that had been working for recognition since the 1960s, had secured settlements from the Japanese manufacturer and from the Japanese government. But the process had taken decades and had required sustained legal and political effort that should not have been necessary. Australia issued a formal national apology to thalidomide survivors in 2023, the first national government to do so, and established a national memorial in Canberra. The apology was delivered more than 60 years after the drug was withdrawn. The survivors who received it were in their 60s. The ones who had not survived to receive it had been dead for decades. What the survivors were living, across all of these countries and all of these decades, was a life shaped by the specific intersection of two forces: the damage done in those 5 weeks of the first trimester, which was permanent and structural, and the cumulative response of the world to people living with that damage, which had been inconsistent and often inadequate and was still being negotiated. Both forces were ongoing, neither had resolved. Meanwhile, the drug that had caused all of this had not disappeared. Thalidomide is still made, it is still prescribed, it is still, in certain controlled contexts in multiple countries, a drug that doctors give to patients and patients take. This is not a pharmaceutical industry oversight. It is the consequence of a discovery that emerged from the disaster's aftermath, a finding that the molecule responsible for the most catastrophic pharmaceutical event in history also does something useful in adult bodies that nothing else does as well. The connection was noticed, in various forms, through the 1960s and 70s. Researchers studying the mechanism of thalidomide's teratogenicity, trying to understand why it destroyed fetal limb development, found that the drug inhibited the growth of new blood vessels, a process called angiogenesis. In a developing embryo, angiogenesis is essential. The blood vessels that supply the forming limbs must grow into position during exactly the window when thalidomide was disrupting them, which is part of why the damage was so precisely timed. In an adult body with a tumour, however, angiogenesis is something different. Tumours build their own blood supply. They recruit new vessel growth to bring them the nutrients they need to grow and spread. A drug that inhibits this process does not help a developing embryo, but it may help a patient whose cancer is growing blood vessels it should not have. By the 1990s, researchers investigating thalidomide's potential in multiple myeloma, a cancer of the plasma cells in bone marrow, found that it produced responses in patients who had not responded to other treatments. The results were striking enough that the FDA moved toward approval despite the drug's history, because the history of a molecule does not alter its chemistry, and its chemistry was doing something in myeloma patients that other available drugs were not doing. In 1998, the FDA approved thalidomide for the treatment of erythema nodosum leprosum, a painful and disfiguring inflammatory complication of leprosy that had previously been difficult to treat effectively. The approval came with the most restrictive prescribing controls the agency had ever applied to a pharmaceutical product. The program was called the System for Thalidomide Education and Prescribing Safety, the STEPS program. To prescribe thalidomide under STEPS, a physician had to complete a specific certification process and register with the program. To receive the drug, a patient had to undergo counselling about its risks, demonstrate understanding of those risks, use 2 simultaneous forms of contraception if they were of childbearing potential, submit to a negative pregnancy test before the first prescription and before each monthly renewal, and be registered in a monitoring system that tracked their use. The prescription itself could not be filled without confirmation that these requirements had been met. The system was designed with the specific goal of making it essentially impossible for a pregnant woman to take thalidomide without the intervention being detected and interrupted. The STEPS program represented the full distance between 1957 and 1998 in pharmaceutical regulation. In 1957, Grunenthal had not tested the drug on pregnant animals because no one required it. In 1998, the FDA required that before a pregnant woman could receive thalidomide, she would have had to pass through a certification process, a counselling session, a pregnancy test, a contraception requirement, and a monitoring registration, every one of which was designed to catch a situation that the entire regulatory apparatus of 1957 had not possessed the concept to prevent. The molecule had not changed. The system around it had been rebuilt from the ground up, using the blueprint that the disaster had provided by showing, country by country and decision by decision, exactly where each component had been missing. The molecule had not changed. The same structure that bound to cereblon and disrupted fibroblast growth factor 8 in a 4-week embryo also inhibited the angiogenesis that fed a myeloma tumour. The drug that was sold as a sleeping aid and accidentally destroyed the arms of 10,000 children was the same drug that, administered to consenting adults under monitored conditions, was extending the lives of patients with cancers that had not responded to other treatment. The disaster and the remedy were the same compound. This is not irony in the literary sense. It is chemistry. The molecule does what the molecule does, in both directions, and the difference between catastrophe and treatment is the system around it, the testing, the monitoring, the informed consent, the understanding of what it does and why and to whom. In Brazil, that system was not working. Brazil is the country with the largest ongoing problem of leprosy in the world outside of a handful of nations in South and Southeast Asia. Leprosy is treatable with antibiotics, but the inflammatory complications that follow treatment, including erythema nodosum leprosum, are painful and disfiguring and have been difficult to address with other medications. Thalidomide is one of the most effective treatments available for these complications. Brazil's public health system had been distributing it since the 1960s, before the international mechanisms for controlling its use were developed. The drug had, in the context of Brazilian leprosy treatment, a history and a supply chain, and a clinical culture that predated the post-disaster understanding of what it required by way of control. Brazil enacted legislation in 2003, Law No. 10,651, intended to regulate thalidomide prescribing and prevent its use by pregnant women. The law required counselling, contraception, pregnancy testing, and monitoring. The law was not effectively enforced. The public health infrastructure in Brazil, particularly in the regions where leprosy was most prevalent and thalidomide most used, was not consistently capable of implementing the requirements the law mandated. Self-medication was common. The drug's availability in the public health system, approximately 5.89 million tablets distributed between 2005 and 2010 alone, more than any other country's public health system in the world, created a supply that was not always accompanied by the controls that were supposed to constrain it. New cases of thalidomide-damaged children began appearing in Brazil in the 1960s and had not stopped. Researchers documenting the Brazilian situation in the 21st century described cases of children born with thalidomide embryopathy decades after the drug had been withdrawn everywhere else, born to mothers who had taken it for reasons related to leprosy treatment, in contexts where the information about its dangers had not reached them in a usable form, or had reached them and had been overridden by the severity of the condition they were treating and the absence of equally effective alternatives. The Brazilian situation is the clearest evidence that the story did not end in 1962. It is also the most direct illustration of the compass line's second clause, that the tragedy was the absence of warnings to ignore. In Brazil, in the 21st century, there are warnings. They are written into law. They are embedded in the prescribing requirements. They exist in the system in the form that the post-thalidomide regulatory apparatus was built to create. And they have not been sufficient because a warning embedded in a system that does not fully reach the person who needs it is, from that person's perspective, the same as no warning. The gap between the knowledge and the patient is not always visible from inside the system that holds the knowledge. It becomes visible in the children. Brazil's public health system distributed approximately 5.89 million thalidomide tablets between 2005 and 2010, more than any public health system in the world during that period. The scale of the distribution reflects the scale of the leprosy problem and the effectiveness of thalidomide in treating its complications. It also reflects the scale of the monitoring challenge. 5.89 million tablets moving through a public health system that covers the entirety of Brazil, including regions where infrastructure is limited and where the connection between a prescription written by one physician and a pregnancy monitored by another may not be reliably maintained. The law of 2013 required the controls. The controls required an infrastructure. The infrastructure was not uniformly present. The gap between the requirement and the reality was the space in which the new thalidomide children were born. The tragedy of thalidomide was not that people ignored warnings. The warnings did not exist in 1957. They exist now in the most detailed and legally enforced form that drug warning systems have produced. They exist in the STEPS program and in the Brazilian legislation and in the international pharmacovigilance networks that the disaster helped build. They exist in the training of physicians who understand what the drug does and why it must not reach a pregnant woman. And in Brazil, in the 21st century, they have not been enough. Not because anyone ignored them, in many cases, but because the gap between the warning and the person it needs to reach has not been fully closed. And in that gap, in the distance between what the system knows and what the patient knows, the damage continues. This is the shape of the story's end, and it does not resolve into the form that endings are supposed to take. What thalidomide produced in the wreckage of the disaster was not just suffering. It produced teratology as a scientific discipline, the systematic study of how chemical exposures affect developing organisms, with established methods, specialist journals, international research programs, and a body of knowledge that has protected every fetus carried by a woman who took a pharmaceutical product since 1962. It produced reproductive toxicity testing as a requirement of drug development, the animal studies that Grunenthal had not run and no one had required, now mandatory for every compound entering the approval process. It produced chiral pharmacology as a regulatory consideration, the understanding that mirror image molecules must be studied as separate entities, that the structural identity of a drug matters for its biological effects in ways the pre-thalidomide era had not systematically examined. It produced the Kefauver-Harris amendments and everything they created, the decades of regulatory development that followed, the FDA as it operates today, the drug approval process that the rest of the world modelled against and adapted from, the standard of evidence for pharmaceutical safety that is now so embedded in the practice of medicine that it is difficult to remember it did not always exist. It produced Frances Kelsey's name on an award given annually to an FDA staff member, an award she received first, in 2010, at the age of 95, from the agency she had served for 45 years and reformed by doing her job carefully on a September morning in 1960. Kelsey died in 2015, at the age of 101. The New York Times described her as having left a double legacy, preventing a medical tragedy and improving drug protections for everyone. Her bust, sculpted during the years when she was famous, ended up in her daughter's living room. She was not, she had always said, a person who had done something heroic. She was a person who had looked at a drug application and found the data insufficient. The system had provided a mechanism for that finding to matter. The mechanism had worked because she was the person using it at that particular moment. What she had done was demonstrate by accident the difference between a system that asks the right questions reliably and a system that asks them only when the right person happens to be at the right desk. The survivors of the disaster are still here. The number alive globally was estimated at between 5,000 and 6,000 as of 2012, and the estimate is older now, and the number is smaller. They are in their 60s and 70s. Their bodies carry what the drug did in 5 weeks of their first trimester, and they carry 60 years of compensation for it, and the combination is arriving at the accounting that bodies eventually present. They have spent their lives navigating a world not designed for them, in bodies that required adaptation, with institutions that provided support that was always less than what the damage warranted and always later than it should have been. What they also carry, though they did not choose to carry it and should not be required to bear it as a consolation, is the infrastructure that was built from the shape of what happened to them. Every pregnant woman who takes a medication today takes it in a world where someone has asked and been required to answer whether that medication is safe for the developing child she's carrying. The question did not exist as a regulatory requirement before 1962. It exists now because of what happened in the hospitals of West Germany in 1958 and 1959, and in the hospitals of Britain and Australia and Japan and Canada and Spain and everywhere else the drug reached. The question nobody asked is now the question everyone is required to ask. The infrastructure that was absent is now present. The warning that did not exist has been built piece by piece from the precise shape of its absence. That is not consolation. It is not supposed to be consolation. It is what happened, and what it produced, and what it continues to cost, and what it continues imperfectly to prevent.